Okay, I think we can sort of get started on we'll do a little bit of a rolling start. I think the first thing I want to do today is acknowledge I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people in where Vancouver, Canada is located. It's a privilege to be able to live in and work in their territories, and in which I am I'm a welcome guest. I would also like to say, well, just to introduce myself, that I'm Juan Pablo Alperin. I'm associate professor in the Publishing Studies program at Fraser University. I'm also the scientific co-director of the Public Knowledge Project, as well as the co-director of the Scholarly Communications Lab, a research group studying questions of scholarly communications. I think that we are all here to sort of acknowledge and celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Budapest Open Access Initiative. I think that the speakers and panelists that are here with us today almost need no introduction, but I will, in any case, give them just a very brief one, because I think that I'm probably with all of you share this moment in knowing and acknowledging that these are people that have led the open access movement and from which we have all taken guidance and cues and inspirations over the last 20 years. And having them here today is really a true honor for me to be able to host this webcast, to be able to ask them some questions about where they see open access going into the future and about the recommendations that they have put forward. So joining me, and here I won't be able, because I've had to, due to technical difficulties, I've got everyone on my phone, but I've got, I will try to sort of go down the list of folks in the order that I see them. But I will start with introducing, well, first of all, Heather Joseph, who's the executive director of Spark. And I think, again, all of you probably know every one of these speakers, but I will still go through them anyway. Melissa Hageman, who is the senior program officer of the Open Society Foundation in the Access to Knowledge area, and I think also you all know Peter Suver, who is senior advisor on open access at Harvard Library, is also here with us today. Irina Kuchma, who is the Open Access Program Director at IFL, who is joining us, and very grateful that she is able to join us today, given the situation in Europe. And Dominique Babini, who is the Open Science Advisor at Claxo, and also a longtime friend, one of the very first people that I ever met in the open access movement face-to-face way back when I started back in 2007. So again, it's a real pleasure and honor to be able to share this moment with all of these people who have been at the forefront and who I've been looking to for the whole time that I've been interested in open access, since I've been working in this space for not quite the 20 years that BOAI has, but pretty close to that amount of time. So I think I will just kind of get us started. I think you're all here because we've seen the recommendations that have been put out from BOAI. I think that a link has been shared in the chat to the recommendations themselves, and I think if we can also probably see the slides that has sort of the 4 summary recommendations. I won't spend sort of very much time going through these because I think we want to make sure that we allow time for questions and the conversation, but we want to just sort of flip through them as I'm speaking, where you can see the 4 recommendations. Like I said, I won't sort of go through and read them all. You have them available to you as a link, both in the slides and summary form, and the link on the BOAI page where you can see the recommendations themselves. But maybe we can just, if Chelsea or whoever is driving them can sort of just kind of go through them as I finish giving a couple of very small introductory remarks to these recommendations. BOAI, like I said, has been, I think we can almost say, responsible for the open access movement as a movement itself, not the concept of open access or the ideas necessarily behind open access, but in terms of having been a driving force in consolidating a community behind open access that's able to advocate, giving shape and a voice and a name to some of the efforts that I think many of you here today have likely been working towards for a long time. And so what I know that these recommendations have come, you can see, in every 5 year and every 5 years or so, BOAI, the steering committee and the group that has been behind it, have put forward some document to help provide a vision and some guidance for the community. And so I think I want to just start with as an opening question to give any one of our panelists here today just an opportunity opportunity to just tell us briefly how these set of recommendations came together and why they thought it was important to put forward recommendations without getting into the specifics of the recommendations, but just to talk just very briefly about the process that led to them coming together. So I'll open that for anyone that wants to share a little bit about how you arrived at these four top level recommendations in the document that's behind them.
Thank you, Juan. I'll start out and welcome to everyone. And thank you so much to Spark for organizing this webcast. As background, we started over a year ago to hold conversations about what to do around the 20th anniversary of the BOAI. 10 years ago, we held a larger meeting in which we brought together leaders of the movement and developed new recommendations. Given COVID, we didn't feel like this was the best year to bring a large group together. Instead, we looked to the community and we asked for direct recommendations as to what the movement itself thinks would be helpful for directions and guidance over the next 10 years. We then went through a process of synthesizing and discussing the community's recommendations, and that's really how we arrived at these four recommendations. As we say in the summary, there are many, many ideas, and we could have added many more, but we thought it was really helpful to concentrate on a few to give those more weight and hopefully be more helpful for the movement as a whole.
Great, thank you, Melissa. I think just important for us to get that little bit of that context about how the consensus is that was reached and the input that was gathered from the community, and for everyone that's listening in today to understand where these recommendations have come from and how they emerged. I'll start then with I think the way that we're going to work this, we arranged is that I'm going to have about four longish meaty questions to ask of all of the panelists, just to give a sense for the audience of how this will work. I'll ask the questions. I'm going to let any of our speakers here take the lead in answering, and then I'm hoping that some of these questions will evolve into a bit of a conversation. And I'll just be mindful for time to making sure that we allow that conversation to flow, but also give it make sure that we're also able to move on to some of the other questions that I've got on hand today. But so I'll open it up with the first question, which has struck me as I read through the recommendations, is that while the recommendations are specific, some of them are specific to OA, I think some of them are also actually targeting and simultaneously trying to address some of the larger issues that in how academia is functioning. The role of incentives, for example, which is touched upon as one of the four key recommendations, I don't think are specific really to OA, but rather to targeting an accountability culture that goes far beyond whether work is published openly or not, or the modes in which research is available. And so now that I see as OA has gone mainstream and it has been accepted as the status quo, it's no longer like a small rebellious movement of a few people trying to advocate for something. I guess the question that I want to ask is if you still see OA advocacy and the work of people that are really trying to promote open access and its implementation as the most effective way to encourage the broader changes that I think that some of these recommendations are trying to get at, those changes in academia that are more broadly. So I'm happy to open that up for anyone that wants to take on that question. I see Dominique, I'll let you take that first pass, and I see Heather, I acknowledge your hand as well. You're muted, Dominique.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, and thank you for your introductions. And in Latin America, we thank you for your personal commitment and the PKP commitment for open access being possible in scholar-led initiatives in Latin America. Thank you so much. To your question, is it an effective means to encourage broader changes you wanted to see in the academia? Yes, the answer is yes in my case. And we need open access advocacy to work together with other stakeholders for those changes needed in the academia. Let's take the example of research assessment. After 2 decades of growth in open access publications, only a very small fraction of those research outputs in quality open access venues are considered in research assessment. Mainly what is published in English, in high impact factor journals, and charging with APCs to publish in open access. From our developing region perspective and reality, my institution affiliation is CLAC, so it's a network of research institutions in Latin America. This is not the way forward for an equitable and sustainable open science future. This is why the BOAI recommendations detailed concrete actions that encourage those broader changes needed in the academia in support of equitable openness. Thank you, Juan Pablo.
Heather, you had your hand up. If you want to, I guess, either to respond or to continue a conversation with Dominique, and then Irina, I see your hand as well for after.
Yeah, thank you, Juan, and thank you, Dominique, for that beautiful lead-in answer. I would build on what Dominique just said, and Juan, in answer to your question, first I want to observe, I think it always surprises me when people say open access is now mainstream, right? It's now in the zeitgeist, it's in the water, and I hope that is the case. And on my most optimistic days, I'm right with you. I'm not 100% convinced that we're quite there, but I do want to build on what Dominique said, that advocacy is still critically important to raise awareness for open access in order to do what, right? In order to engage those critical stakeholders that Dominique just so eloquently mentioned. I think here in North America, bringing along the administrators, higher education leaders, department heads, leaders in different disciplinary communities to understand open in order to build a more equitable system of knowledge sharing has lots of different dimensions. It's, I think, more important than ever for us to kind of keep our foot on the gas in terms of advocacy for openness and service of equity in terms of knowledge sharing.
Thank you, Eric. Irina?
Thanks, and building on Dominique's and Heather's comments, I think it's advocacy plus practice, because we are 20 years, so we've already tried things and we see what's working, what's not. And I think what's also important with our recommendations that we're really saying that there is no one way of doing it, that there are different ways, and it's up to you. It's important that research community takes control and ownership of scholarly publishing infrastructure and processes, but it's really up to you to find a solution that really works well for your local context. So it puts researchers and research institutions in the driving seat.
Thank you, Irina. Anyone else want to continue, or even if Dominique or Heather want to come back in, that's also would be okay if you want to continue on. I guess one of the core reasons that I asked this question is because sometimes when so I'll use just to kind of keep prodding or trying to poke a little bit and trying to dig a little bit deeper, because I appreciate the answers that you're giving us. But the reason I saw some of this question is because the questions that I see sometimes within my own role as a researcher and as a faculty member around where the incentive structures lie in is they seem to be sometimes focused around where the university is allocating the resources and where they want to see my activities as a researcher sort of focused on, and trying to push towards certain kinds of research that isn't necessarily it's that the publications might not always be the only, it's not about where I publish my work, but even the kind of work itself that I do. And I think that culture that tries to promote doing research that's going to lead to a published output versus, let's say, doing research that's going to engage more with a community, or that's going to be doing work that's communicating and trying to sort of engage the public in those broader ways. And I think some of the questions around incentives, it's like if we sometimes think about the open access movement has been one way that's facilitated those conversations around helping the universities to see the larger picture around the importance of public access, the importance of global equity. But there are also, there's other pressures that have almost to do with not publishing at all. It's about just doing the work and being academics and being out in the community. And so this is where sometimes I struggle with the role about thinking and focusing so much of the attention around the open access and the publications as the central mechanism, that I wanted to just get a little bit of your take on as to thinking about whether OA puts too much emphasis on the published outputs and is distracting from some of the larger pictures around equity and publicness that I think could be seen from the lens of things that aren't outputs.
I think Peter has his hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see you there. Peter, go ahead.
Sorry. I think my hand icon is invisible against my background.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question. And I think there are two ways to read it. One is what academic reforms are necessary to bring about open access. And the other is, once we achieve or realize open access, what academic reforms will it trigger in turn? And the second question is a very good one, in part because we've almost never discussed that. I think we could all anticipate or guess or conjecture or hope about what academic reforms OA could inspire or trigger that are not themselves directly related to OA or academic publishing or scholarly communication. But we've focused mostly on the other version of the question, which is what reforms do we need in order to make progress on OA itself? And in our document, our new recommendations, we focus on a couple of those, open infrastructure, research assessment reforms, and funding models that we think are obstructive. But I love the idea of focusing on the other version of the question. I have to do more thinking about it. Some of my say most hoped for academic reforms are very far from open access. For example, I think most universities, at least in my country, have tilted away from permanent tenure track protected faculty toward adjunct faculty who are not adequately paid and are subject to being dismissed for almost any reason. We have to tilt the other direction, but I don't see the achievement of open access doing much to solve that problem. In fact, there are interesting complications. The more adjunct faculty we hire, the less we are paying them to give away their work. And one of the premises of the open access movement was that faculty are paid to give away their work. And the less we pay them to do their work, or the less we protect them for publishing their conclusions, the less that premise supports the rest of our conclusions. But I welcome the larger global conversation about what might happen as we make further progress on OA to trigger other desirable academic reforms.
Great, thank you, Peter. Okay, and anybody else want to add something to the mix here? Otherwise, I'll move on to a
yeah,
second
maybe
question.
I'll add briefly.
Go ahead, Irina.
In Europe, there's a very promising coalition on research assessment where universities who are really doers got together and they'll be leading the way on research assessment reform, and we'll already see some excellent developments in the Netherlands and also in a number of other universities in Europe. And yeah, I'm really optimistic that this year we'll see some real progress in that, because that's one of the things that was really hindering open access developments in the past.
Okay, thank you, Irina. I think this question, I think the answer, Peter's answer, also helps to segue a little bit into what was going to be my second question when thinking a little bit about the economics. And so in my reading, and I think, which obviously other people might interpret differently, but when I read the recommendations, and again, perhaps from my lens of having worked with the Public Knowledge Project for so long, but I read them as much more explicitly, a little bit in direct opposition to some of the the commercial solutions that have, in opposition to the commercial publishing landscape that has developed. And when I read through, in preparation for this, I read through even Jean-Claude's recommendations, reflections from 5 years ago, which were already, I think, really starting to point to the challenge that some of the commercial actors have, or the oligopoly of publishers have kind of imposed on the higher education landscape and the publishing landscape. And so in my reading, I see that the recommendations are really trying to encourage us all to move to stakeholders and all stakeholders to move away from those commercial solutions. And I think I see that in the recommendations to away from to community-owned and open infrastructure. And so I would say, would you go as far as saying that in sort of 2022 and in the time that we're in now, it's no longer acceptable to accept and not applaud these gains that we've been seeing in open access when they don't conform to, I think, the decentralized and scholar-led vision that I think is applauded, and that I think in Dominique's answer earlier and in the work that we do in Latin America, that's the model of open access that we have in Latin America. So should we continue to applaud when there's gains in OA that seen broadly that don't conform to that vision? Heather, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think maybe the framing of should we applaud or not applaud might make it it's a little bit difficult to answer, because it's hard to say to people who share the same general goals, you're doing it wrong, right? That's one way to splinter a movement super quickly. So I understand where the question is coming from. But I think the way that we've tried to think about this is to be self-reflective and to look backwards over, what we've learned over the 20 years of the OA movement, and strategies that seemed in the beginning like they may move us towards the end goal that actually have consequences that, coulda, shoulda, woulda. Maybe if we had thought differently about them, we would have moved in different directions. So I do think, though, that once you become aware of the difficulties that moving in commercialized directions can lead to in terms of baking inequities into structures and systems, it's impossible to unsee that, and we shouldn't unsee it. We need to continue to move forward. So what we really tried to do with these recommendations was to say, we have to look at what we've learned and build and move forward on this. So I don't think it's about applaud or not applaud. I think it's about being clear-eyed and realistic and saying we can do better, we need to do better, and we need to keep our focus on structures and systems that at their heart use openness as a tool to promote equity and knowledge sharing.
Okay. I think I purposely did ask the question in a way that was a little bit more controversial to dichotomize it a lot more than perhaps we might want to. And of course, I would expect your answer to not be baited by that framing, Heather. But I did want to put it in, I think, in those starker terms, just to help us to trigger that conversation. Dominique, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Heather. Yes, how we build openness, no? Yes, that's the issue, because 10, 20 years ago, we didn't imagine the obstacles we have today. And it is, of course, understandable that in countries with privileged research institutions and budgets, and where scholarly communication industries hire workers and pay taxes, it is understandable that those countries are many times more supportive of the idea of including the industry in the decisions and implementations of open access publishing. But if we look at global research challenges, as is the case of climate change, sustainable development goals, this pandemic, then all issues that require as much local as international knowledge. And if we look at the very high percentage of research institutions in the world with very, very scarce resources for research and for publishing, then we need to encourage and invest in strengthening scholar-led, non-profit alternatives, so we can work towards this more equitable future for publishing and for research.
Thank you, Dominique. Others that want to comment?
Just go ahead, Peter.
Oh,
I
thanks.
keep not seeing your hand, Peter.
Yeah.
It keeps blending into that background.
That's right. I have to change my background. Yes, I agree. I want to build on what Heather said. First, one of the first things we agreed on when we started deliberating on these recommendations was that we wanted to push back against APCs and push back against read and publish agreements. At the same time, we acknowledged that APC-based OA is growing and it's real OA. And read and publish agreements are triggering the growth of OA. However, we wanted to say, and by the way, we welcome that growth, and we say that we welcome that growth in point 4.3, if anybody wants to look it up. So in that sense, there's one cheer for APCs and read and publish agreements, not three cheers. We wanted to make the point, however, and we say this in the preface, that we must assess the growth of OA against the gains and losses for the further ends. OA is a means to an end. The further ends that we identify are equity, quality, usability, and sustainability. We make an argument in sections 3 and 4 of our document that APCs and read and publish agreements do grow OA, but they do it at the expense of equity and sustainability. So they're short-term growth, not long-term growth.
Yeah, thank you. Irina, go ahead.
And also, we come from different countries, and like some of us believes in markets, some of us don't believe, but no matter whether you believe or not, you still don't want to support monopolies. And what we try to stress in the recommendation that for us it's important to have diversity, bibliodiversity, and really encourage that and make use of that and enable that.
Thank you, Irina. And Melissa, go ahead.
Thanks, Juan. To build on both what Peter and Irina were just saying, one of the reasons, or really the driving reason that OSF, the Open Society Foundations, first took an interest in this area 20 years ago was because of equity. And I think over the past 20 years, that not necessarily got lost, but it wasn't at the forefront of our work as much as we would have liked. And so that's why for us, these recommendations are so important, because we do emphasize it at the very beginning that this is why we are supportive of the open access movement and want to do more to support its further growth. You know, we see the inequities caused by lack of access to this research around the world. So that's really been our the driving reason why we have been involved in the movement since day one.
Thank you, and again, with very much the appreciation I think that we all have for that vision and of being supportive of the movement when there really wasn't a landscape of other people really trying to support it in the way that OSF has. I mean, I think we've already started to touch upon the topic of, I think my next two questions are sort of focused on some of these things around APCs and read and publish agreements. You know, I very much appreciated the recommendations to move away from APCs and for having that recommendation be so clearly stated and so emphatically. Like I think Peter, with you know, given despite the one cheer that's in there, I think overall the recommendations are very strongly in opposition. And you know, as you know, it's a stance of being against APCs that I and many others in Latin America have taken for a long time. Not just for the exclusion in participation that I think is noted, but I think also because I think it unfairly extracts resources from regions of the world like Latin America who end up paying for both what they're publishing themselves, because they are funding and supporting the journals directly, and then for what their authors do, because regardless of whether they publish them in the region, because they're paying those APCs to other parts of the world, I think. You know, so but at the same time, I think we've already acknowledged in this conversation that APCs are very entrenched and they have grown. It's a big part of the growth in OA is coming through APCs, in part because I think they have proven to be a very profitable way of actually doing publishing, as publishers have realized that this is a good way to continue to grow their businesses as well as creating more OA. And so the recommendations are in opposition to APCs. So my question is there, do you think it's realistic to envision a future in which APCs sort of get rolled back, or that we start seeing a decline in the use of APCs for all of the challenges that you present and that I've just summarized? Peter, go ahead.
You're right that they're entrenched. APCs are entrenched. And if you count implicit or explicit versions of that statement, we say so 7 times in our document. And one reason we are taking aim at them is that they are entrenched. If they were one funding model on the side of many other funding models, we might not bother, or they might not be at the center of the target, but they've become entrenched and they deserve this attention. They deserve this critique. Yes, I think it's feasible to move away from APCs. First, it's worth recommending, even if there are obstacles in the way. And we are making long-term recommendations, not necessarily short-term recommendations. We're not pretending that we can move away from them tomorrow, or that the global academic community can move away from them tomorrow, but we can all make progress, and we've already started. And I would say the goal is actually realistic, in part because green open access exists and diamond open access exists. They are both widespread and mature models, and those are the chief alternatives today to APCs. So we don't have to invent something brand new to take the place of APCs. And then alongside the existence and the growth of green and diamond open access is the fact that a growing number of institutions and individual researchers now recognize the limitations of and the disadvantages of the APC model. So we can build on that, plus the mature alternatives, to make progress away from APCs.
Okay, Irina, go ahead.
And what we also start seeing that more and more universities started adopting policies that include social justice as an underlying principle. And for example, University of Cape Town revised their open access policy around that, and they specifically said that they would support research which is of African importance and for Africans, and they specifically stress the importance of library publishing and local African journals. And I think that's one of the notions we should move away. We should really move away from international journals and really support, promote, strengthen diamond open access journals, as we see in Africa. There are also some developments in Europe on that, and of course Latin America. I'll hand it over to Dominic.
Yes, go ahead, Dominic.
Thank you. Building on what Peter and Irina said, for the 70% of open access journals in the world that do not charge APCs, supporting APCs has a perverse effect, a perverse incentive for non-APC journals to start charging APCs. And we are seeing that already in developing regions. And we see predatory businesses built because of huge profits that are possible with APCs. Why should scholarly communications be a market? It can be part of the research infrastructure that countries ensure for a research cycle and its component for communicating results. This is why BOAI recommends that institutions spend new money on alternatives to APCs rather than APCs themselves.
Can I ask you a little follow-up, Dominique, around this? Around, the recommendation is for that to, to spend those resources and invest in things that are not APCs. But as you say, the incentives by the existence of APCs is one that is going to encourage more journals to try to move towards that model to sustain themselves, even in areas and parts of the world or people where they were able to do so and find other means of doing so. So my question to you is, do you see the growth of APCOA expanding into other regions and into other publishers that were previously ignoring them? Are they falling for those perverse incentives, I guess is my question.
The research assessment system, and mainly the research assessment system, is pushing journals to think about charging APCs in our region, because they see it's a way to get more impact factor and to be rewarded also in the research assessment. So it is happening, and we are concerned about it because there are other ways. If we reward, as Jean-Claude Guédon mentions, now if we reward quality instead of rewarding prestige of where we publish, it would be another story.
Thank you, Dominique. Before I move from APCs to read and publish agreements, which is maybe it's not really moving on from APCs, but just looking at them from a slightly different lens. Anyone want to say anything else about APCs and the reason why they featured so prominently in your recommendations today? I mean, like I said, the read and publish agreements, or transformative agreements, as they are, I think, the misnomer of transformative agreements, as they're often called. I have the same kind of similar concerns about that I see for very much similar reasons. I think they're creating further mechanisms for regions like Latin America to pay for the global south, the global north's open access, while the rest of the world is not contributing to their open access, since it's predominantly non-APC based and it's already OA. And so, this, in my view, these agreements are essentially creating further costs to the global south that they're having to bear because they managed to do open access in a different way, and in a way that I would say in the right way, within, in quotes, saying in a way that I think is more sustainable and more equitable, as we've already heard some of our panelists say here today. You noted that the respondents were kind of divided on them. I think that there's some people are welcoming these sort of read and publish agreements and transforming agreements because they are growing the amount of OA, and that others see some of these negative effects. And so I wanted to see, and this I would like to go around for everyone and to be able to share your own perspective on transformative agreements, the role you see them, how you feel about them generally, the role you see them playing, and whether, how you see them kind of existing in the landscape going on into the future. So whoever would like to tackle this one first, but I will go around, I think, to everyone to get just at least your brief perspective on these types of agreements. Irina, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can start, sir. So we're really trying to look 10 years ahead, and 10 years. If we look ahead 10 years, then I don't think we'll have transformative agreements, because that's not a long-lasting solution. So what we're focusing are in the recommendation are the solution that would really help the movement in the long run. So it's temporary, it's transitional, and I hope transition will be over sooner than in 10 years.
Can I push you a little bit also on it? That's the long term, whether you don't see them lasting, but do you see them as an effective way of getting us to? So if they will disappear within the 10 years, but do you see them in the shorter term as being a good development and a strategy that is working for the broader goals that I think you presented in the recommendations?
Well, it really depends where you are, like in which context you are, in which institution you are. So I see them working for small Eastern European countries for specific publishers where there are really well negotiated deals and agreements, but it's for sure not a global solution, and it won't cover all the publishing that is going on.
Okay, thank you, Irina. Who wants to tackle it next? Peter, I see your blurred hand. Go ahead.
First, I want to note that by asking us to speak individually, we're speaking for ourselves.
Yes.
What we agreed on as a group is in the doc, and the doc is an argument against reading and publish agreements. One reason I think it will be hard to move away from them is that under current circumstances, they can be good deals for universities and they can be good deals for publishers. That means both universities and publishers have reasons to keep signing these agreements. Those incentives or interests exist under circumstances that we want to change, but it'll take a while to change them. For example, our second recommendation is on research assessment. Our first one is on open infrastructure. If we make progress on those two, then I think the case for these agreements collapses. That is, why spend money on APCs or APC equivalents if it doesn't matter where work is published? If making it open access, regardless of the prestige or quality metrics of the platform, is all that matters, then we don't have to start to pay current prices to make work available. But making progress on open infrastructure and research assessment is a long game, and we have to be ready to play the long game. And in the meantime, circumstances will exist that give universities and publishers good reasons to keep signing these agreements. So I'm not saying they're good without qualification. I'm saying they're good for the institutions that make them under current circumstances. And in order to move away from them, we have to aim at changing the current circumstances.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Before I move on, because we have to, Heather, I'll put you next. Before, just to invite the audience, I think we'll probably have just a very few minutes at the end for some questions. And so just to invite you to start putting them in the chat now so that we can kind of, I get a chance to kind of skim through them as we get the next few responses. And then I can try to ask one or two of them to our panelists. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I would say that we've been under pressure on both sides as a library organization in North America to look at read and publishing agreements and make a recommendation one way or another. And we really resisted coming out and saying anything supportive about doing it, not just because of, not solely because of the negative net effect that it has on the global South or regional ability to contribute to the collective record of scholarship and science, but just within our own member base, right? We have such a wide diversity of institutions, and we're trying to promote a much more inclusive and representative system for all voices to be represented in scholarship. And what we see with read and publish agreements is that they really disadvantage different institution types. So here in the US, for example, historically Black colleges and universities, minority serving institutions, tribal colleges and universities, the economics of read and publish agreements don't favor them at all and just simply throw up new barriers, but author side barriers for participation in what we're trying to promote with the BOAI, which is the global common intellectual conversation. So it's been something that has been difficult to do, but we've kind of said a hard no. The most important thing to us was not just to say no. And what I think we also tried to do in these recommendations is not just say no to APCs and read and publish agreements, but really try to define and push what to say yes to instead. And I think that's where our collective energies and efforts are, we're really trying to focus that and try to use these recommendations as a springboard for moving in that direction.
Thank you, Heather. Melissa or Dominique? Whichever one of you wants to jump in.
Thanks, Juan. I don't know if I can put it any better than Heather. I think that's exactly where OSF lands on this issue. And as I mentioned from the outset, one of the driving forces for us getting involved or organizing the meeting back in 2001, which led to the original BOAI, is because of access in the Global South specifically. And I feel like what we came to 19 years later was not paying to read the material, but paying to publish. And that's the exact wrong position we wanted our 20-year investment in the movement to land on. So I think that's why this is so important to us. And while we originally saw growth with the movement with the APCs, we really need to diversify, and the recommendations provided through the 20th anniversary hopefully will lead in a new direction.
Thank you. And Dominique.
In the past year and 2 years, we have seen several international documents from the science community, from UNESCO for open science, from the international science community, from the European community, about the future and the open sciences and imagining that future. And we have addressed 4 obstacles and how to deal with them, because it's only 4 recommendations, but with 40 lines of actions possible to move forward and to go towards a possible sustainable and equitable future for open science, because these agreements comply with the needs of the industry to transform the subscription-based model to APC business, but it does not transform scholarly communications. So we address actions that can go to that direction for a more inclusive and equitable future for scholarly communications.
Thank you, Dominique. I think, you know, what Peter says is true in the sense of the benefits that individuals see, whether they be institutions or publishers, but also we see them at the national level with some of the national level agreements. I was present in Colombia on something unrelated, and I ended up at having a meal with folks that had just walked out of the negotiations for Colombia's sort of first kind of social read and publish agreement. And they were explaining to me the deal that they'd struck, and they were so happy about the great accomplishments because they had ended up paying less than what they were paying for in subscriptions, and managed to now also have APCs covered for many of those journals. But I think missing in that picture is this the broader global effects of every time that one of these agreements is supported. So even though the individual parties involved are winning from these deals in a sense, or they feel like they're winning in a sense, they are creating a larger global effect and further pressures. And I think that's what I really appreciate about the actions that are presented in the recommendations, is that they give a way of helping us to help all of these parties think through what are the consequences of the decisions that they have been making, and the decisions that we've made in the past, for example, around the support of APCs, and that we're making in the present around support of these agreements, which is maybe not a question in itself, but what I suppose I will finish it up with, as I then will look through for some of the audience questions. I think we'll have just a couple minutes for a few of those, is to say, you know, what have you found to be, as you've been trying to think about this movement as a global movement, and having to think about also the individual pieces and all of the parties, and how some things work in some areas and some don't. I think we heard that in some of your answers today. What is the challenge or the compromises that are struck within those local solutions and those global consequences? What is, I think, maybe the biggest challenges that you face in putting together these recommendations with both of those lenses in mind, that the individual things that work and the larger global pictures? And I guess a very broad question, I know, but I'll just ask it as I read through the questions from the audience. How did you strike that balance of the local and the global? Peter, go ahead.
We talked about that very problem. It was a tension. We say in 1.6, platforms and infrastructure policies and strategies are most effective when they take local constraints and cultures into account. We all believe that, and yet we had to make, or we wanted to make, recommendations. So would our recommendations be so general that they would violate our own principle on that? We hope we struck the right balance. It's right there in the open for anybody to judge for themselves. We made some general recommendations, and then we tried to be as specific as we could in the bullet points underneath them. And one of the bullet points is to support a plurality of approaches in order to take local constraints and cultures into account.
Thanks. Irina, go ahead.
Thanks. There is also one more layer that we're forgetting, which is like regional or continental. So you have locals and you have Latin American, African, European, I don't know, I guess North American, but I know less about that context there. And I think what's important is to understand like institutional and local priorities, have an agreement on that on this continental level, and then work together and discuss how that could be implemented. And we've already seen collaborations between, for example, La Referencia in Latin America and LIPSANS in Africa, and also on research assessment reform, what Africa could learn from discussions and developments in Latin America. And then there are also some promising developments in Europe, which I also try to align with what's going on in the global south.
Right, thanks. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I just wanted to say we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge our colleague Leslie Chen, who also participated in this conversation. And when Peter, you were talking about, you know, the conversations that we had in depth over the last year, Leslie's contribution to helping us always stay focused on that, the necessary tension and the necessity for us to balance local, regional, indigenous with global was really invaluable. So I just wanted to make sure to say thanks, Leslie, and we wish you could have been here with us today.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Heather. I appreciate that. Dominique.
Thank you, Heather, for bringing back Leslie Chan to the room, and building on what was mentioned before about plurality of approaches, and mentioned by Peter and Irina, mentioning collaboration among regions. When we share experiences and concerns with our open access initiatives and advocates in India, for example, or in some countries of Africa, we agree that a great part of our research output is invisibilized in the present scholarly communication system, and the global present communication systems, and in the indicators used for research evaluation. So we are very enthusiastic about the international standards, international interoperability possibilities, and open infrastructure possibilities. That's the way forward. So all the voices can be included, all the languages can be included, all the formats can be included, because we have research output and we have other knowledge produced by the community, other stakeholders, which are building knowledge on challenges. If we look at any of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there's not one that doesn't need as much local as global information. So interoperability, collaborative models, sharing resources, that will allow us to build a better future for open science, which is promoted this year by UNESCO.
Thank you.
This past.
Yep. Thank you, Dominique. We have just another few minutes. I want to give a very short 1 minute or 30 seconds or 1 minute answer to this one of the questions from the audience is that I think will be a nice note to end on. The question is, it would be really great to hear what open scholarship reality that each of you can envision as being possible, with a bit of a timeline. I guess it's a question around how optimistic are you feeling about where open scholarship is going, and when we're going to get there. So just go around with, again, in any order, but just with a very brief 30-second answer to give us, or 1 minute at the most, answer on what is the future you see possible and when do you think we'll get there?
I can maybe start, sir.
Yeah,
so
thank you, Irina. Yeah.
We're building on UNESCO recommendation on open science, and a lot of member states, I mean, almost all member states agreed to that, and that's already part of national roadmaps. So I'm optimistic that we'll see quick changes outlined in UNESCO recommendation on open science.
Great. Let's go rapid fire around. Whoever wants to jump in next, just go ahead and jump in. Heather, you've lit up. Go ahead.
I saw Peter light up at the same time. I'm like, yeah, I'm maybe not quite as optimistic as Irina, but I do see us really at a point. I know I gave you a little bit of guff initially, Juan, for being so optimistic that OA had become the norm. But you know, on good days, when I look back 20 years, I could never have imagined that we'd be here talking about the nuances of how. So I do think that, you know, well within the next decade, we should be hopefully on the downside of the ski slope.
Yeah.
I'll be able to make that statement without you giving me any guff, is what you're saying, in 10 years?
One can hope.
Thank you. Peter, go ahead.
I'm definitely optimistic, but it's more long-term optimism than short-term optimism. I do believe the slope of the curve is up rather than down, but it's shallow rather than steep. And 20 years of that kind of growth has led us to where we are now. You're right that OA is mainstream. It's not the norm, it's not dominant, but it's moved from the periphery to the mainstream. That's definitely progress. Imagine 20 more years of a curve moving upward at a shallow slope. That's what I expect. And the reason I expect a shallow slope rather than a steep one is that the major remaining obstacles are cultural. And it's easier to adopt a policy or build a piece of infrastructure than to change culture. That's what we all have to work on. It's even hard to get leverage on that and figure out strategies for doing it. We are doing it. And by the way, one of the biggest causes of cultural change in the right direction is the actual growth of open access. That is, it's gone from being unfamiliar to being familiar. It's gone from being something whose benefits were mysterious or conjectural to something whose benefits are obvious and well documented. And the more that sinks in, the more culture will change. But that takes time. I'm optimistic that it will happen in time, just won't happen tomorrow.
Thank you, Peter. Melissa or Dominique?
Thanks, Juan. Well, looking back 20 years ago when the BOAI first defined open access, no other funder wanted to touch it. And now we have such a rich group of funders with the Open Research Funders Group that have embraced open access or driving it forward. And when you see governments and private funders really embracing it, it gives me much hope. I think Peter and Heather mentioned as well, there's still the cultural element which needs to change, and that will take time, specifically research assessment. Juan, I know it's something that you have worked on so much, and I really think that if we are able to address that, then movement will be much quicker. But from 20 years ago, when BOAI first defined open access, I'm thrilled that we're here with a great portion of the world's research output now openly available.
Thank you. I think we've lost Dominique, and I don't just want to make sure that she has not just lost her video, but she's still there. She's gone. But unfortunately, because I would have loved to have gotten her take as well, but I think we are at that time. And so let me just finish here by saying, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, just one quick note. We're very grateful we have a translation of the recommendations in Spanish, and Juan, you helped with that. Thank you. And we also have offers to translate it into Polish into French. And if there's any other interest to do it in other languages, we'd be most grateful. Thank you.
I think Portuguese as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so we did work on that translation of the Spanish, and like I say, we welcome the others. Having those recommendations available in all of as many languages as possible will be part of having this document, which I think is really a wonderful contribution to help us to think and organize our thoughts around how to move the open access movement forward, and have that be led and with participation from every corner of the world, and not have it be led only by those that are participating and speaking in English. And so please share that broadly with everyone that is interested in thinking about questions around open access. This certainly is a wonderful resource. So let me just finish by saying thank you all for not just for being here today and not just for the invitation to share this stage with you, which is really a great honor and privilege of mine, but also for the work that you have been doing for these 20 years in between leading up to these recommendations. I think that the progress, the energy, the vision and enthusiasm that you've put towards, as well as all of the concrete actions that you've taken, including the specifics and clear supports, intellectual, financial, and in every other way to the movement, have got us to where we are. And I think as a community, I will speak on behalf of everyone saying a great big thank you to you all, as well as a thank you to the audience for joining us today and for contributing. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but it was really great to have you here and sharing the space with us today.
Thank you, Juan, for your good questions and for leading the group today.
Thanks, Juan.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Good to see everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye all.
Bye.